You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katja Bartsch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
All right, we are back, and I'm excited to talk about this topic. It might seem a little off topic for us, but it really does connect to so much of what we do at Yoga Medicine, and so much of what drives our teachings and our processes at Yoga Medicine. So I'm really excited to talk today about more of this idea of personalized medicine and individualizing medicine and how that relates to a lot of different things that we do, whether that's training or yoga. And talk about a few different topics within this as well. So let's start with a little bit of I think history maybe is a good place to start. I'll let you take over from there.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this too, especially for those of us who are interested in kind of combining the current research with our teaching, with our practice. I think this will have a lot of takeaways, and also looking at the history of personalized yoga or personalized training, personalized medicine is enlightening in itself, I think. So I think the term has been used a lot, personalized medicine, and that actually started around the year 2000 or in the 2000s, early 2000s, when the mapping of the human genome advanced. And that's when also the understanding in medicine advanced and opened kind of the window to looking more at individual responses to treatments, for example, to pharmacological treatment. So from then on, treatments were designed that spoke more to the individual makeup, genetic makeup of people. So in cancer treatment, many people may be aware of that. And that's also termed genomic medicine, or precision medicine is also a term that's sometimes used. So some of the listeners may have come across that type of treatment before. So that was kind of like the first step to take that more personalized approach. And of course, in our field, it's less about the medical or pharmacological part of it. So that also then went further in the research. So by the mid-2010s, it was also acknowledged that not only the genetic makeup of a person can influence how they individually respond to certain treatment, but also, for example, other extrinsic factors or also other biomarkers, so lifestyle, or also in terms of biomarkers, for example, the microbiome came up as one factor that could influence how a person would react or respond to a certain treatment. So that was still rather pharmacologically based, I would say. And where it gets really interesting for us also as yoga practitioners, yoga teachers, is when this whole perspective moved more also towards the sports and exercise realm. Because by the end 2010, so that's not even too long ago, also from the movement perspective, exercise perspective, physical activity perspective side, we've been starting to look more at the individual response to some sort of intervention. So for example, understanding that not all individuals respond in the same way to endurance training or strength training. So some people may actually increase their VO2 max, which is a measure of endurance, in response to an endurance training program, but others may actually not respond to an endurance program. They might increase their VO2 max, which is a classical endurance parameter, in response to resistance training. So, and that perspective has been explored more, and I think we can speak a bit more how that is being done or what that would look like in the research. But that type of perspective, I think, also resonates well with us in yoga, where we've been trying to look at what the individual needs for quite a long time, and now the research is also supporting us with that perspective to a greater degree.
I think it's so important now too, because we live in this time where we love having protocols. We're learning more about that, and it's empowering us. And it's so helpful to know that for many people, strength training responds best in this protocol, or endurance training in this one. But it's such a great reminder too that we are still all so unique. And, it's really what drives us at Yoga Medicine is rather than the cookie cutter approach is being able to individualize it to the person to enhance our outcomes. So really cool,
Yeah.
I think.
I think as well. I think that speaks so much to what we're doing at Yoga Medicine, but also generally to the yoga realm, sports realm. A lot of what's out there at the moment in the fitness area, or also generally in sports, goes into that direction of finding a more personalized approach, also in nutrition, for example. And of course, what has come up alongside of that was that wearables play an even bigger role. So at all of the last kind of sports conferences or meetings where practitioners and sports scientists, for example, meet, this has been one of the major topics. So it remains one of the major topics. Wearables, how much data am I recording? What am I doing with that to get the best set of exercise or training, rehabilitation, whatever that is, for the individual. So gather data individually and then cater whatever program we're looking at also more individually. So that's a really highly current trend or topic also when we bring the technology in. So that's another current area of interest that is driving forward with big speed and with a lot of attention.
Which I think is so fascinating. Like we spend so much time, many of us, with wearables and trackers, even if it's just a watch or something simple, or, a lot of people have Aura rings or Whoop bands, or, there's so many different ways to track. But I also think it helps us connect to some of that individualization, which I think is kind of lost a lot of times on things like Instagram or social media, where we just love having, whether it's nutrition or fitness or yoga, we love having like the protocols or the things or the foods you should eat for X, Y, or Z, or the yoga poses for this certain thing, or the exercise program to build strength. And the reality is life isn't that simple. But if you don't have the ways or the means to connect to personalized medicine, whether that's wearables or having and we'll talk more about this in a moment, but having a specific person or a doctor to go to, I think trying on some of those can be interesting. But the important part is, and for me, this is the yoga side, is the listening, is to not just blindly following these protocols that we're seeing, but or even the wearables and the data, which we'll talk about more, but listening and sensing how my unique makeup, not just genetics, but my environment, my lifestyle, my work, my day, my week, my year, my gut, all of the things are influencing that too. So.
Yeah, you went through a nice list there. So those are some of the hot topics. So of course, other factors, more intrinsic maybe, are of course sex differences are one that are being explored quite a bit at the moment. Circadian rhythm is being explored quite a bit. I recently went to a conference where we talked about, or data was presented on circadian rhythm and, for example, synthesis of collagen, so all types of processes that might be relevant in responding to training or even to a yoga session. They could also be influenced by when I train during the day, for example. So that's another big one. But also more complex studies, what they're trying to do at the moment is really link social factors. So what are you being exposed to in terms of social determinants throughout your life? Let's say, in what neighborhood, in what country are you growing up in? What is your nuclear family like? What is the physical activity environment you have available, like stuff like this? And then combine that data with genetic information. So how would that influence your epigenetic makeup? And then how would that, for example, influence your physical activity level or your fitness level or your injury level? So those are things that are being explored in the research. It's really hard to study that because you can imagine if you want to track someone along their life, and especially looking at those social impacts someone has been exposed to throughout their whole life journey, that's really hard to track. What individuals are we following for a really long time to get that information? So that's another one that's really tricky, but I think will be so informative in the future to have that combination. So how are our individual systems impacted by what we're exposed to on a social level? What does it do with our epigenetics, and how might that influence how we move, or how we approach movement or an active lifestyle? I think those are really cool questions that are being of relevance at the moment. Age, of course, also plays still a big role when it comes to the internal ones. So many approaches we can take there, more social or maybe public health perspective, but also, of course, from a training science, nutritional side, so many perspectives that are currently explored and I think are really exciting there.
And so interesting, like mind blowing. And then sometimes the other side of that is kind of overwhelming too, because now as humans, we become aware of all of the things influencing us, and some in our control, some out of our control. And I think again, all of these can be such useful tools to keep in mind, and there's no way to like perfectly track all of this or know which one of these is the big influential factor, but to kind of be tuned into it and be listening and be noticing potentially how some of these things are helpful. So, talking about how this is kind of impacting our practice and our teaching as yoga teachers, I think first off, I'll just say the first thing is just knowing this, I think, is a really impactful thing. Knowing that it's not a one size fits all, which we talk about it on here a lot in a lot of different contexts. But I think also for me, one of the first things that comes to mind is that, again, the listening is required. Even if I have all the wearables, I still want to be tuned into my responses to different things. And sometimes journaling and writing things down can be really helpful to reflect back and notice. But I think there's so many applications in yoga too.
Yeah, but why don't we go there first? I mean, the wearables topic, I think, is certainly an interesting one, and where yoga or any form of mindfulness can come in, because any of us who have some sort of wearable technology or is tracking some sort of lifestyle or health data through any device will maybe be familiar with that reaction to what you're recording, right? So one approach or one example that we've also discussed previously was, for example, sleep. Maybe you're wearing an Oura ring or a watch that is telling you how well your sleep was, and maybe your own perception of that is very different from what your device is telling you, and that will then influence how you actually how sleepy or how awake you will feel throughout the day. So I think that's a really interesting one, that we are also reactive to the data we're then seeing from the devices. And I think that's where yoga, where any form of mindfulness can be so helpful to put that into perspective and to maybe feel first. Let's say in the morning after you've slept, feel first and really get your own baseline, your own internal data, and connect with that before you look at a device. And then maybe just use that to kind of double check, or not even look at that all the time. Maybe just go through a period where you track something, but also don't lose or relearn to really connect with yourself as well. I think that is a very important competence when we are more relying on wearables or have them more available in these days.
I really resonates with me, because it's actually why I had an Oura ring. I wore it for a long time. I learned a lot from it. I loved it, and now I definitely take breaks from it, because it's so easy to kind of look at those numbers and feel a different way. And I think it kind of took me out of myself and out of my own inner knowing and listening and sensing. And although I do think watching that data on sleep can be really beneficial for a while, I do think it's helpful. And obviously this depends on the person, the context, of why they're using it other than this. So, for athletes or other scenarios, it might be more interesting to keep that on long term. But for me, I think it helps to take breaks to keep that inner awareness going that can be lost a little bit. I mean, I'm sure other people sense that as well.
And I think what you just said, I mean, yes, with athletes, it might be part of a bigger story on how we evaluate certain data, but also for someone who's not like an elite athlete. And what also connects with yoga or mindfulness approaches is being intentional with the data. So really being intentional what I'm tracking and why I'm tracking it, and just using every function I have on my device may also not be leading to big results. So really considering what maybe sleep is a thing, maybe sleep is a big topic, and then it makes sense to track that, or maybe other parameters are, but really finding that intention behind it and making that a very conscious choice instead of just collecting everything we can and then doing something with it or not. But also the intentionality of it, I think, also plays a big role.
For me, that speaks to like the obsession behind it, which many people and myself too can have, especially as you start adding data into these wearables where they ask you to like fill in information each day, which can be really helpful to analyzing the data. But I think it can be obsessive. I think probably a lot of people feel that as well. That again, is this all this data that I'm adding to this? For me, this is always the question too, is like, is this useful information for me to collect? And at the beginning, sometimes all of it is, because I'm looking at these patterns and I'm trying to watch it over time and I'm watching responses. And so I think when you start using wearables, it can be helpful to do a lot, go like kind of overboard at the beginning to kind of see, and again, paying attention to what's influencing your symptom or your problem area, which again, we could just say is sleep maybe, or something else, or energy levels or recovery or whatever that might be. But then eventually for me, and again, this really does depend, especially with competitive athletes, this might be a different story for some people for different reasons, but I find it to be really interesting to kind of back off of that, whether it's not wearing the wearables or putting less information in and really focusing on the topics that feel most resonate or are most influential on those kind of pain points or whatever kind of symptoms you're working with, and not obsess. It's a fine line because it's hard. It is hard to back off once you've been tracking all of those things to not obsess. So
Completely agree. Completely agree. And I think this I mean, we've talked about wearables now for a little bit, but generally that knowledge that the research is catching up now, and we are also looking at intra-individual personal variability in how we respond to things, to a yoga class, to, I don't know, a session of running or a resistance training program. We are only starting to understand how or what the influencing factors for each individual are. And we can use wearables for that or not, doesn't matter to a certain degree. But I think what that also tells us, just on a very general level, is that this is being looked at in the research. We've been doing that in yoga for a long time, but just knowing that this is a thing in sports science, for example, or in medicine at the moment, I think also just underlines or reiterates what we as yoga teachers and practitioners have hopefully been preaching for a long time, been practicing, been doing for a long time, and that is really catered to the individual that's in front of you. I mean, ideally, when you work with someone one-on-one, you have that to a bigger extent than in a group class. But even there, I think it just underlines and gives even more reason an argument to why we maybe find words, find cues that really encourage the individual to find a variation, find an option, use props, whatever that is. But I think, yeah, it just underlines that. And we all know, all of us who are teaching, how hard that sometimes is for the people on the mat to really accept that they're doing their thing to a certain degree in class. And I think that knowledge can be nice to help with that, or to find even cues that support that maybe.
And I think our own greatest wearable is really our own awareness, our body awareness, our interoception. It really is like the core of what we do with yoga. And there's so much more. In all of our therapeutic trainings, I always start the training, the first couple of minutes of every training is talking about, okay, the first thing we do when we're working with people one-on-one is instilling body awareness. It's simple, but not easy. That can take a couple of sessions. That can take a year or two. but that instilling this kind of empowerment of my body awareness is such a core part of what we do as yoga teachers, and so important, like these wearables, because this is where I can tune in and really sense and feel in a different way, in a very real way, subjective, of course, but a very real way, these changes that are happening. So I think it's helpful to think about it that way. We know the power of wearables. You've always got one inside of you. You've got one built in.
It's the built-in wearable. I love that. I'm sure I'm going to use that in the future. My built-in wearable. I love this one, and yeah, I think that's so empowering. And to me, and I think many of us here in that community, we really love to bring in the research, or to look at the research and let it inform what we're doing, and let that inform maybe our programming or how we approach a certain population we're working with. And I think that that new perspective, hopefully, I mean, also will inform what we're doing to a greater extent in the future, because there will be more studies on, let's say, how individuals respond to different types of yoga, for example. But also just, yeah, as you mentioned, just knowing that, and coming back to that idea of inner awareness and your own built-in variable. I think that's an oldie but goldie, but also in the light of the new research is even more on vogue, maybe when we look at it from the research side. So I love that those aspects are there now, becoming congruent with what we're looking at in the research right now, this moment in time.
And like all research, there are, of course, downsides to it. And I think those are important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. And I think maybe let me just speak a couple of sentences what we're doing in the research now. So thus far, most of the research you've probably looked at to bring into your teaching, into your understanding of yoga, is typically group difference based. So in medicine and sports science, what we're usually doing is we have one group of people who receive a certain intervention, let's say a certain kind of yoga programming, yoga class or so, or they receive resistance training or endurance training, for example. And then we compare them to a control group who doesn't receive that. And we see if the group who got the yoga or the endurance training or whatever, if they had better outcomes, for example, more flexibility or more strength or more endurance parameters than the control group. And that is then being analyzed statistically for the whole group. So you look at the whole so-called intervention group compared to the whole control group. And that's the majority of research still. But what we're looking now more is the individual aspect of it. So we look at all the individuals who receive the endurance or strength training or yoga class, and then we look what their individual change over the intervention is. So maybe some people, let's say we do a yoga class, and some people feel less stressed after the yoga class or after the yoga program. But maybe we see in that cohort that some people might actually be more stressed for whatever reason. So, and that's the perspective that the newer research now looks at. So it looks at the individual reactions, so to say, or adaptations in response to a certain intervention. And then it becomes interesting, because then we look at the people who responded very strongly. So maybe those who feel much less stressed after the yoga intervention. And we also look at the ones that have maybe even more stress or feel more stressed after yoga. It's a made-up example. I don't know of any study who specifically did that, but we would look at those two kind of extremes and the individuals that we find in those extremes. And sometimes, unfortunately, the ones in our example that would experience a reduction in stress, we would then call, for example, responders. And sometimes in the research still, the ones who now maybe feel even more stressed or have no changes in their stress, those are then sometimes called non-responders. And that, of course, is a label that no one would love to have, right? So a non-responder, that's a label, that can even be damaging. So that's definitely a downside. So you don't want to be the person who is a non-responder, because now you may feel no change in stress or may feel even more stressed. For us in the research, it's interesting, because then we can see, do we find common denominators among those groups. So maybe I'm really making this up now. It's a bad example, but let's say all the people in the yoga intervention who feel now more stressed. Maybe it was all men in a certain age group and they just felt off in the yoga class for some reason because the social context of it didn't feel right to them or they weren't comfortable. So in the research, it's interesting to look at those kind of extremes because it can inform future interventions, it can inform future research, but labeling them non-responders, even if you read an article about a study you participated in and then describing the people who felt more stressed as non-responders is really just maybe a downside of it. And hopefully we also in the yoga context don't think of the people we work with in terms of non-responders or responders. But that terminology is still out there. So I would say that's definitely a downside.
Well, I think we're thinking about it in a way of like, we're using certain practices and noticing that it's not changing things and then trying new things. So I mean, obviously we wouldn't be wanting to use those kinds of terms, but I think, and I know you and I both agree, like feel the same about this. I think this is really interesting because in research, we kind of look at the headlines and the abstracts and the big takeaways, but when you dig into the nuts and bolts and the details, and a lot of times this detail isn't always there or isn't included. But if we can look into those details, especially with yoga, I think it's so interesting. And I actually think your example was great. I mean, think about a lot of men feel uncomfortable. They feel like they don't belong in yoga, like they're not doing it right because, they look a little different than the typical female, which is our typical demographic in a yoga setting. And so it would make a lot of sense that their stress responses might be a little bit different. And especially maybe even we put more to the story and maybe that's until they become more educated about yoga and what the goals are and that it's not about range of motion and they start to feel more comfortable in that yoga setting. Maybe that changes too. I think these are all such interesting things because context is everything. We know that with epigenetics. We know that with so many other things. We know that with athletic training. It's everything. And so I'm so glad. It's so cool to see the research moving in this direction and supporting that. I know it takes, I'm sure, a lot more work on the research side to collect all this information and to use it and to put it into the research. But it seems so, I'm assuming, but it seems so well worth the effort.
Yeah, and I mean, there's depending on what kind of research design you use, what I can definitely say is that there's a lot of new kind of research models or research designs evolving with this. I can also link to one of the articles in the show notes. For example, the NIH proposed with regards to exercise a couple of new study designs that have been used that are really exciting. So if you're into study methodology, it's exciting. So I'm just going to link to it in the show notes if you're excited about stuff like this. But yeah, there can be quite elaborate studies, but also, of course, a case study now maybe informs that perspective initially, which potentially is a bit easier in terms of study logistics compared to a randomized control trial. So it allows just for more different new study models, study designs, which can be really exciting. And yeah.
And of course, case studies, in the research world don't hold a lot of weight, but that's where the bigger studies begin. Everything kind of begins there in those smaller cohorts and case studies. And that's where maybe it's easier to collect a lot of those details. So yeah, obviously some downsides to research as well. Obviously the collection or non-collection of information, but what other downsides are we seeing?
I would say maybe related to the downside, but to me, it's even more of an upside. With that discussion around terminologies such as non-responders, what has evolved in the research from that potential downside or from that potential label is that we know that certain interventions that's more known from endurance and strength training, but I'm sure we will soon have data on modalities like yoga as well, is that response to an intervention is, of course, I mean, probably also intuitive, is also dose dependent and modality dependent. So let's say, for example, again, your endurance capacity, often measured with VO2 max, your maximum oxygen consumption. For some, I already hinted towards that, but for some people that's increased through endurance activities, so through running programs. And that's the one that you would think of first because VO2 max is an endurance parameter. But others don't respond to running. And I'm 100% sure that in the crowd of our listeners, there are people who are just not into running and they don't feel that their endurance really increases when they run because it's just not their modality. But there are now studies who have shown that individuals who don't improve their endurance in response to certain bouts of endurance exercises, they may respond their VO2 max in response to strength training. So it's just one of those nice examples where coming from that perspective that also comes with certain labels, we're learning that the type of intervention you need, endurance versus strength, for example, is just influenced by so many factors and may differ from individual to individual. And I think we can also translate that to some degree already into yoga, even though we don't have data there. But there's so many different aspects of yoga. And I mean, everyone who said, I took one yoga class, it's not for me, probably hasn't gained an overview of the broad and deep variation that exists within the world of yoga. And I hope that would be something I would be excited to see, is that we will understand in the future a bit better what determinants of different yoga styles, different yoga modalities, or different yoga elements can play for individuals. And we will understand that maybe a bit better on an individual level in the future.
I think that's really interesting too, because there's so many moving parts in yoga. I mean, down to like the location of our yoga studio and how easy it was to get there, and traffic, to checking in, to the temperature of the room, the lighting, the interpersonal skills of the teacher before and after class, the people around us, how friendly. I mean, I've lived in a lot of different cities, and sometimes yoga communities are very friendly, and sometimes everyone's really quiet, which is fine. I mean, some people have essential oils, some people have props, the cues we use, the language we use, the modifications we offer. I mean, so much in our language, I think, as teachers, there's so much nuance there. But the style of practice, the poses we choose, I mean, you have to imagine that as a student, there's always going to be classes you show up to where you're like, I just really don't love those poses, or I didn't love that flow, or I didn't love that restorative practice. It doesn't resonate. And for me as a teacher, I think one of the coolest things I always love to teach is the curiosity behind that, and remembering that you can get something out of every practice. Sometimes it's kind of shifting my mindset or allowing the space for myself to modify. I always like to remind my students that they're their own best teacher. And so it is up to them ultimately to decide to modify just based on their own personal experience, to grab blocks, to just do something different if you have to. I always assume if someone's doing something different, there's a reason. And I'm happy that they're choosing to support their body. So I think as teachers, there are ways in group classes we can support this too, through the empowerment of our language, offering some choices, which can also be overwhelming. We can also offer so many choices that it can feel overwhelming as a student. So it's kind of, I think, this art of reminding them that they're in charge, that they're listening, maybe with those moments of listening at the beginning and end of practice as reminders. I mean, there's so many ways, and you're not going to do all of the things. You can't put that on yourself as a teacher. But I do think there are a lot of ways that we can support this inner knowing, inner wisdom, even for people who are new to yoga. People who are beginners need a little bit more guidance, maybe a few less choices, but more modifications maybe, and props and options. But I just think there's so many ways that we can work with this, which again can also be overwhelming, because if I'm trying to meet this person, whether it's one-on-one or in a group class, it's never, like there's never like an optimal scenario for every person. Everyone's going to like different things. Breath work. I mean, with nervous system regulation, one of the things we always talk about is, I think one of the biggest things is finding something that's really calming to them, something that is useful to them. For some people, that's restorative. For some people, it's absolutely not. For some people, it's breath work or MFR. And I'm trying to find at first those easy interventions. But it is so subjective, and there's so many ways that we can support this in yoga, this individualization. And even in a group class, I think through those options we offer and that empowerment, we remind them of in their choices, in being their own best teacher to make those choices just based on subjective experiences. So cool, I think, in yoga.
I fully agree. I also think it has potential, especially for those who've been teaching for a longer time, to just remain aware that this combination of factors is ever evolving, and that can also keep teaching always interesting, or inform that always to a different degree. And I love that you shed light on the person participating, on the yoga practitioner there. I also think, and I like what you said there with regards to the teacher, we cannot put everything on our shoulders. And I think just being more aware of that personalized perspective and the many, many, many factors that influence everyone's individual experience, and also potentially adaptation to or response to a certain intervention such as yoga, we cannot influence that all. It is influenced by so many other things, and for us as teachers, that also gives us a bit space maybe to be okay with that there are many, many other things on each given day, in each given class, in each given session we have with someone that are influencing their experience. And we cannot put all of those factors on our shoulders, and maybe also gives us a bit of space to breathe. Of course, we'll always try to do our best, but there are many other things that we cannot influence. And especially maybe also for those who are starting to teach, this can also take some weight off of your shoulders, I think.
And I think it's a good reminder too that in a group class we can't individualize. As a teacher, it kind of takes that what we off of our shoulders to some extent. There's almost no way to individualize. And I always think it's funny, we'll ask sometimes like, what do you guys want today? And it's like, well, one or two people are raising their hand, but there's a lot of people in this class that aren't, that have different things. There's no way to please everyone. The only way to individualize a group class is through that embodiment, through the individualization that comes as I make choices as a practitioner as to what props I use, what modifications I take, maybe poses I skip. I always offer this option of visualizing. I think we know neurologically we get a lot out of postures. Maybe you're in pain or unable to do a movement, to be able to visualize that movement happening, that range of motion happening, that pain-free, easeful movement happening really vividly is a really powerful thing as well. So the only way to individualize in a group class is through our choices. And maybe that's even just my energy input, energy output. Maybe I'm going through a flow class, but I'm more introspective and conserving my energy and more mindful of my breath in a given practice. Or there's just being mindful of how I approach it, being intentional. I love that, practices where there's a moment of setting your intention, which sometimes can be challenging. Maybe you're just there to get out of your head, and that can be an intention. But there really is that reminder of you really can't, the only way to individualize a group class is through my own personal intervention as a practitioner and the small shifts that I can make to meet myself there along the way.
I love that. I almost think we should end on that note of individual empowerment. Because I think it also speaks to that inner for free wearable, and those are for me, for myself, from that conversation, just two ideas or two visuals or two concepts that I really appreciate, and I think we can take away from this as yoga practitioners, as yoga teachers. Thinking about that, also bringing that research perspective, that very current research perspective in it, but making it very accessible and translating it into our yoga context.
I love that. So I think just to recap, we're looking at, basically research moving toward these more individualized responses, which is so cool for so many reasons. We've talked about this trend toward individualization. Thank goodness, because we're all so different. And we're all non-responders in some way to different things, right? Because we're such a unique makeup of things. So we're really just encouraging people and empowering people to find their best options, which sometimes might be informed by wearables, but really that this body awareness that yoga is our great built-in wearable that we can tune into anytime. And as yoga teachers, remembering too that we need to adapt these practices to meet the individual. And in a group class, though we can't do that, we can offer ways to empower our students to embody their role as a teacher. We also know that the research is limited, and, again, it may not resonate when we're looking at research articles. The outcomes may not resonate individually, like the endurance training example that you had before. Like, some people need different stimulus to invoke that same outcome. And so I think just a reminder of how potent our yoga practices can be, just the simple stuff, instilling body awareness, listening. A reminder too, I think in yoga, we're kind of trying to take away that filter in the listening of judging things as right or wrong or good or bad, but also just noticing and watching how our bodies, how our mind, how our feeling in this world and our expression in this world is changing through all the things, whether that's our yoga practice, the things we eat, the supplements, or even pharmaceuticals that we take. Such a great, I think, support to our medical and healthcare providers too, just to be able to give better information about how we're responding to medical intervention, surgically, pharmaceutically, whatever that might be. I think it supports so much of our lives. So such a great reminder, I think, of just the power of something simple like our body awareness and our listening to be able to inform so many of our choices. And hopefully that gives you a little bit to empower yourself and your students and some good reminders. I hope this one's been helpful. I've really enjoyed hearing and sharing it with you. So we look forward to the next one. If you have any topics or comments, feel free to always share those with us in the comments. And we love hearing what you guys are enjoying. Or if you're enjoying our podcast, even better, leave us a 5-star review. That's the best way to show your appreciation. And we hope to see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.